Bede, I have to tell you that when I first started to really look seriously at theism and the philosophy of religion, I came across certain ideas which initially seemed almost totally irrelevant. God being a necessary being seemed like it really wasn't that important. But the more I got into it, the more I realized how central an understanding this was to the theistic hypothesis that God is a necessary being. And I've wrestled with that, and it's not an easy concept to understand. So help me understand what it means to say that God is a necessary being, and then let's see what that means.
Fine. There are two conceptions of necessary being that are relevant here. One that you find in Aquinas makes out God's necessity to be a matter of his eternal, unlimited, indestructible character. Right? He's there for the duration. You can't do anything to get him out of the things. All right. Now, that's quite an interesting one, but the question arises, is there such a being? If there is such a being, then he can't cease to exist, perhaps, but that doesn't prove that there is such a being at all. So we're left with the basic existential question. Now, the other notion of a necessary being is a being whose existence is logically necessary. Yes. And that one has been rather harder to make sense of because people have complained that you can't have any statements of existence that are logically true. Before going on to that, let me mention a rather intriguing argument you might like to think of that's due to 20th century philosopher Norman Malcolm. You know, of course, the ontological argument. Well, he claimed...
Which is that if you can imagine the greatest possible being, then that being has to exist somewhere.
That's right, yeah. It can't be just in the mind, otherwise it wouldn't be the greatest possible. So it has to be in reality. Right. Well, he finds fault with that argument, but he says in the St. Anselm, who originated the ontological argument, you find another one, and it's very simple. It goes like this. God's existence is either impossible or necessary or contingent. Now, by contingent, I mean he may or may not exist, right? Now, those three possibilities are exhaustive. His existence has to be
There's nothing that it can possibly be other than one of those three.
Right, and so you go through them and you say, well, it's against his nature to be contingent. That would just make it like his creation. It's surely not the case that his existence is impossible. What does that leave? His existence is necessary. Now, the trouble is, he explains necessary in terms of the first characterization I gave from Aquinas. And the trouble with that is a necessary being in that sense could exist only contingently. Right?
Whoa, you lost me on that one.
Well, God is defined as being a necessary being in the sense of being totally independent of everything, indestructible, unlimited, eternal. The question arises, is there such a being? There may or may not be. Right. So if you can say there may or may not be, then in that sense, if he does exist, it's only contingently so. So what he is doing is presenting us with an argument that seems to show that God's existence is logically necessary, but then when you look more closely at the way he defines the terms, you can see that that's not so.
Well, something like this has been said, that God is logically contingent, meaning that it's possible to conceive that God might not exist, which I think you may think, but he is factually necessary. That means that I don't know, I'm not sure what that means, but the concept is that by knowledge of existence, he's absolutely here. But if there was there could be, you can imagine a possibility where he could not. Is that coherent?
Well, traditionally it wouldn't be, because they wouldn't leave open the possibility of any such limitation on God, I think. But of course, you get different characterizations of God, and so it might make sense under some, if not under all. So
is the historical tradition of Christian theology that God is a necessary being? Is that right?
actually in both senses. That is, it's logically necessary that he exists. His essence involves existence, is the way they used to put it, and which is very hard to make much sense of. And he's necessary in the sense of eternal, incorruptible, and so forth.
So let's look at each side of that. To say that he is logically necessary, one way I've heard said is that means that any imaginable world or possibility of worlds that you can imagine, that there is none of those would God not exist.
Right, that's right. And the common argument against that conception is that no statement of existence can be a logical truth, can be a necessary truth. And it does seem that that's true of empirical statements of existence. They can be true, they can be false. And the idea, though...
Give some common examples.
Yes. Well, I mean, things come and go, so they don't have to exist. They're here for a while, then they decay, and so forth. Now, interestingly enough, in this notion of indestructible, eternal existence, St. Thomas Aquinas put angels and the human soul and even matter. Now, his reasoning was this: angels don't have parts, so they can't disintegrate or decay. So, so once you've got an angel, he's there for the duration, right? Now, similarly for the soul, that's immaterial, no parts, can't decay.
So they were created, but they can't be destroyed.
They could, because God could take away a sustaining.
Okay, but they don't. Unless you make an affirmative act to take it away, they continue forever.
Yes, but like Newton's first law of motion, right? So.
I don't think Newton had that in mind.
No, but, well,
who knows?
Who knows? That's right. So that's one notion of necessity that you get in Aquinas, and just the other case that I mentioned, matter. You might say, how on earth can you speak of matter as necessary? Well, this goes back to Aristotle. It's the idea, which I suppose we go along with, that any change is a matter of transformation. You've got the same matter, but it now appears in a different form. So you never annihilate anything, you just give it a new shape or character. Or
conservation of matter and energy in physics is...
So that idea, well, it's got a modern resonance to it. Mm-hmm. So those are the more intelligible aspects of the notion of a necessary being, I think. And as I say, the arguments against a necessary being where it's logical necessity have been to say that no statement of existence can have that status. None, because they can't. A statement of existence purports to say something of substance, whereas pure logical truths, they're true whatever the world's like. They don't impinge upon reality. Now, that was the widely held view, I would have thought, for quite a long time, and probably still is. But you might wonder whether you can be so confident that it's true. Mathematics is a region which is often cited here, where you have existential statements which are necessarily true, not true just as a matter of contingent fact. And maybe statements about individuals are always contingent, but the question, why is there something at all, is rather different in inviting a response which doesn't necessarily posit an individual, but says there has to be something or other. Now, that wouldn't be logically necessary without being about anything in particular. It just has to be something.
So that argument could be extended to make that something God?
Possibly, yes. See, the way I looked at it is as follows. You get the traditional notion that God exists of necessity, yes, and that answers the question why there's anything at all.
Yes.
All right. But a weaker statement answers that question. That is, there has to be something. Now, so you've got two statements. There is some being who has to be, yes, and there has to be some being. Right, or there has to be something. Yeah. Now, the stronger one is there has to be, or there is a being who has to exist, God. But if your initial worry was, why is there anything at all? It's answered by the much weaker statement, well, there has to be something, which is a consequence of the first statement. Not as strong.
Well, it's not as strong in terms of specificity, but it is in a sense more inclusive. Because if there has to be something rather than there has to be God, the something can be anything.
Yeah.
So the God piece is not necessary. Even if something is necessary, it doesn't mean that God has to be necessary.
That's right. It's like if you have a lottery, then somebody's got to win if all the tickets have been sold. But there's no particular person of whom you can say he must win.
So it is not necessary that God must win this lottery.
That's the way it's looking.